In this last section, we're going to cover the third and the fourth cause of Japanese expansionism, and that would be C, economic and political issues, and D, domestic instability and foreign affairs. Again, an overview of causes are A, Japanese nationalism and militarism, B, militarism and foreign policy, C, economic and political issues, and D, domestic instability and foreign affairs. I tell you this on each of these videos because you will need to consider which of these is the strongest reason for Japanese expansionism. Economics were a driving force in Japan's domestic and foreign policies. The economy seemed to go through rapid cycles of growth and contraction. When the economy expanded, landless peasants, often women, moved to the cities for factory work and wages. When the economy was less successful, there was mass unemployment and further rural poverty. Failure to stabilize the system meant that monopolies expanded to control more of the economy. It was also encouraged political groups to try to change the political system. With the end of the feudal system and the creation of a modern form of government, there was a concentrated, intentional effort to industrialize. This would mean not only wealth for many, but also security for the nation, especially protection from the empire building Europe and the US. Countries that could build their own industries and export to other nations to pay for needed imports were more independent than countries that could not. This weakness was very clear in nearby China, where the government was unable to prevent foreign powers dominating it, seeking its raw materials and markets for their mass-produced goods. Japan's economy from the late 19th century to the end of the First World War was remarkable. Japan's industrial output increased by 250% between 1895 and 1915, while processing of minerals increased by as much as 700% at the end of the 19th century. By 1900, the Ashio copper mine and its refinery were among the top producers of copper in the world. Railways covered 5,400 kilometers by 1900, vastly reducing the cost of goods since transportation was faster and cheaper by railroads. Monopolies called ZAIBATSU began to form in the 19th century and rapidly expanded in the 20th century. There were enormous corporations owned by individual families that had impressive economic reach. The Zaibatsu Mitsu, for example, was involved with banking, mining, paper, textiles, and more. The financial strength of the Zaibatsu meant that large-scale industries could be established rather quickly and integrated into the economy. They had the capital to invest and the experts and engineers to design and create industries. They had ships and markets for distribution. By 1918, the 8 largest Zaibatsu controlled 20% of all manufacturing, mining, and trade in Japan. Zaibatsu increased in size and power as the country suffered economic problems in the late 1920s. They absorbed smaller companies and banks that were unable to survive. Zaibatsu also worked to control the diet, making sure that economic policies that favored them were maintained. Eventually, allying with the other military factions for survival and business, the Zaibatsu came to be directly connected to Japan's militarism. Industrialization severely affected the vast majority of people. Impoverished, usually landless, rural families sent their children to cities to work in factories as clerks, shipbuilders, and other salaried jobs. This income allowed many to support their rural families, buy more clothing and other manufactured goods, and increase their food intake. This stimulated the economy to produce further goods and jobs. The First World War led to higher wages due to the demand for Japanese goods in markets formerly dominated by the US and European countries that had suddenly shifted to producing war goods such as weapons. Cotton textile exports, for example, rose by 185% between 1914 and 1918. This led to a shortage of workers and therefore higher wages to attract and keep them. More rural poor relocated to the cities for these factory jobs. In 1920, however, the economy severely shrank as demand for Japanese exports diminished. The US and other countries resumed full production after the First World War. This meant that millions were suddenly unemployed, reducing their spending power and unable to send money to their rural relatives. Those who owned farmland responded to the lack of demand for farm goods by reducing farm labor. Since the majority of farmers owned no land or only tiny plots, they were negatively affected by this economic downturn. And then an earthquake and fire destroyed most of Tokyo, Japan's capital, in 1923. The government encouraged banks to lend money at low interest for rebuilding of Tokyo and other cities. There were suddenly more jobs in construction and factories. With more income, workers spent more on food, clothing, and luxuries. This relative prosperity collapsed again in 1927 with bank failures that resulted from the earlier low-interest loans of 1923. Many who had borrowed to rebuild could not afford to pay the banks. Banks that did not temporarily loans for business operations stopped loaning money actually, even to businesses that required temporary loans. The economy rapidly contracted, leading to huge numbers of unemployed workers and impoverished farmers and laborers. Skilled workers such as mechanics, electricians, and carpenters suffered approximately 7.5% unemployment, while over 40% of unskilled workers were also unemployed. Japan's government was unable to address this economic crisis successfully. Then, in the late 1929, the Great Depression occurred. The Great Depression was a major economic downturn for most of the world. It started in 1929 in the United States and soon spread to other countries. Many countries raised trade barriers so that their factories would not compete with those of other states. This meant that Japan, a country that relied on exports, was practically shut off from the United States, its greatest trading partner. Japan's gross national product declined by approximately 20% between 1929 and 1931, and stocks on the Tokyo stock market lost half their value. 50% of small and medium-sized businesses closed permanently. Exports fell by over 40%, and unemployment increased dramatically. With few consumers of agricultural products, agricultural prices declined by 45% between 1929 and 1931, leaving farmers, most of whom did not own land, in worse conditions than ever before. Landless farmers could not afford manufactured goods, and therefore factories remained closed or at a severely reduced rates of production. Unemployment and hunger led to political unrest. There were strikes, riots, and a surge in popularity of communists and other groups that demanded a restructuring of government and society. The government crushed many strikes, arresting tens of thousands, but negotiated compromises between striking or terminated workers and factory owners and others. It was clear to most that the governing system simply did not function for the majority of Japanese people, workers, and landless farmers. It did, however, function for the ZAIBATSU. As banks and other industries collapsed, their share of the economy increased, as it had during earlier problems. Japan struggled to create a national policy to deal with the economic crisis. There were efforts to reduce the debt of farmers and to spend government funds in building infrastructure so that workers would have salaries to spend. There were even plans to send landless peasants and unemployed workers to the cities of Manchuria. This last idea was not accomplished in any magnitude until after 1936. Meanwhile, the government worked to reduce spending, to alleviate the tax burden on its citizens, and to prevent having to import products and raw materials that it simply could not afford. This policy would change in 1936 with the assassination of the finance minister responsible for this policy on February 26th. That's actually called the February 26th incident. He was replaced by a military appointee. Military needs came to dominate the government. The military-controlled government added a 12-year plan in 1936 to modernize and expand the armed forces. Spending would continue to increase dramatically with the expansion of the military and further war. Military production put new stresses on Japan as the state had few natural resources and exported fewer consumer products to pay for imported materials. Eventually, there were labor shortages. Part of the solution to this was to acquire more territory to supply the war economy. Acquiring more territory led directly to more war. In conclusion, economic cycles of growth and collapse really defined Japan during this time. They had economic weaknesses and rural poverty. Their economy was exploited by the ZAIBATSU. And then you get into these cycles where you get the First World War prosperity, followed by post-First World War economic stresses, closely followed by an earthquake and fire and bank failures, which then is immediately followed by the Great Depression, which, creates strikes and calls for new forms of government. And then next thing you know, the military is taking over. So this is one of those major causes of Japanese expansionism. Economic problems in Japan led to instability. The old governing system established by the Meiji Constitution had simply not led to stable economic conditions for the majority of Japan's people. Additionally, the government was unable to create policies to address the Great Depression. China's instability and Japan's interest in Manchuria and other areas meant that there was also a struggle over foreign policy, which was tightly connected to Japan's domestic affairs. Japan's governing system was extremely complex. Some of those complexities included military authorities had direct access to the emperor. The cabinet worked for the emperor and could not be removed by the diet. All ministers had to agree to a particular policy or the policy could not be enacted. The lower house of the Diet, the House of Representatives, was responsible for taxation and budgets and could block funding if it disagreed with policies. The House of Peers in the Diet often worked against the cabinet and House of Representatives since many of its members were former cabinet members that disagreed on policies. The Privy Council and its Prime Minister had direct access to and communicated for the emperor. They had veto power over all government issues. There were also a great number and variety of political parties, ideologies, and even divisions within the Army and Navy. Much of this struggle centered on social, economic, and military policy. The one constant in the entire system was the emperor, who had ultimate authority, often exercised through the prime minister. The diverse and complex government managed to survive throughout the 1920s. This was accomplished through compromise between political factions, suppressing dissidents through laws and prison terms, and occasional economic growth. The Great Depression was the crisis that demonstrated clearly that the system was unworkable. Communism appealed to the millions of unemployed urban workers, although actual Communist Party membership was very small. Communist or Marxist political philosophy advocated the overthrow of all social and economic classes, a complete reordering of society, and an end to capitalism. Under communism, all people should be completely equal, have the same rights, and receive the same of everything. All property should be owned collectively by the people. Under the Peace Protection Law of 1925, but amended in 1928 to allow for execution, the government could arrest anyone who wanted to change the governmental system. This clearly meant communists and related socialists. Over 1,000 Japanese advocates of communism or socialism were arrested in 1928. Perhaps more importantly, the Soviet Union was the world's only communist state. It bordered Korea, as well as the arguably more important Manchuria, where Japan had many interests. Suppression of communism in Japan was part of a larger policy to oppose the Soviet Union. Some conservative members of society wanted to give the Showa emperor full power. They called for him to rule directly without a parliament, ministers, a privy council, or even the ZAIBATSU. Without their influence on policies, they would therefore lose control. This response to the economic and governing problems was popular with rural farmers who suffered greatly in times of economic crisis. They believed that the emperor could and should remove corruption, zaibatsu, and anything else that kept the people from being prosperous and safe. With many on the verge of starvation and without the possibility of moving to cities for work since there were no jobs available, many joined the growing military. Once in the military, they were a powerful conservative force and were able to support young, ultra-nationalist officers who held similar views. The military was internally divided. One group, called the Control Faction, wanted to reform Japan's government rather than overthrow it. They sought to unite the zaibatsu and government officials so as to suppress some of the more radical political parties, have the government tightly control the economy, and prepare the nation for war with China. More radical factions, including the Cherry Blossom Society and the Imperial Way faction, wanted complete destruction of all political parties, as well as the zaibatsu and the government. They were generally in line with the idea of a Showa restoration. They wanted direct rule from the emperor, which then they thought that he would then destroy what they viewed as a corrupt and incompetent governing system. They also wanted war with the Soviet Union and elimination of socialist and communist groups. Communism was a huge threat in their view, as it advocated an end to the institution of the emperor. As a result, these radical factions will attempt a series of coups or incidents. The most important one is the 26th February incident by the Imperial Way faction and other young officers. They attempted to take control of the emperor so as to have him abolish Japan's government. Several of his high-ranking officials were killed, but the whole thing collapses when the emperor refused to support him or them. As a result of turmoil within the army, the government increasingly turned to other army and naval officers. By turning to the control faction, the more radical elements could be opposed. The control faction, now supported by the emperor, the Privy Council, the Cabinet, the Diet, and the Zaibatsu, mainly out of fear of the other more radical factions, essentially took control of the government. This meant reorganization of the economy, suppression of political parties and dissidents, expansion of military spending, and war. The government also worked to avoid any conflict with the Soviet Union. An indication of the strengthening of the military's political position is clear in the appointment of prime ministers from the Army and Navy. Between 1932 and December 1941, Japan had 9 different men serve as prime ministers. 6 of these were admirals or generals from the armed forces. Although there was supposedly a national government in China, the reality was that regional warlords ran practically independent states within China's boundaries. This, of course, prevented a single national policy when a foreign power threatened. Between 1916 and 1928, China was in a state of civil war, as it was loosely divided into regions controlled by warlords. In southern China, there were 7 major warlord groups plus the Chinese Communist Party, based primarily in the cities. In northern China, there were 3 major groups that competed for power and territory. These groups were supported and opposed by a host of smaller warlords, battling on and off throughout these years. Eventually, the warlord Jiang Jiaolin, based in Manchuria in Inner Mongolia, would become the most powerful of these groups. Under Jiang Jiaolin's rule, Manchuria declared independence in 1922 and was relatively isolated from the wars that consumed other parts of China. Jiang's army was also substantial, bringing peace to the region. Eventually, Jiang captured Beijing, the former capital of the Qing dynasty, and other areas in northern China. He allowed Japan to continue developing railways, mills, mines, and other businesses in Manchuria, and in return, Japan's government supported Jiang. Japan's Kwantung army officers, many of whom advocated a Showa restoration and were members of the Imperial Way faction, decided that the government's policy of allowing Jiang a large army and autonomy was wrong, and they assassinated Jiang in 1928. The army officers' motives were so popular with many in the military and civilian population that the government was unable and unwilling to punish the army. After years of war and division, the nationalist political party was able to unite various factions by increasing Chinese nationalism as a result of anti-Chinese discrimination by foreigners living and working in China. At this time, the nationalists announced that it supported the anti-foreign movement and, having made an earlier alliance with the CCP, or the Communist Party, now had enough strength to defeat rival warlords. From 1926 until 1928, the nationalists conquered various warlords, broke its alliance with the Communist Party, and then attacked it. The nationalists brought most of China under their control through a military campaign called the Northern Expedition, which took 2.5 years and involved over 1 million troops. The Japanese Kwantung army officers who assassinated Jiang hoped to weaken Manchuria's administration to such an extent that they would have to take control of the country to restore order. This would allow Japan to annex Manchuria outright, a policy not supported by their government. It had the opposite effect. Jiang's successor, his son, soon allied himself with the nationalists and brought Manchuria officially back into a newly united China. The results of the nationalist Northern Expedition included the following: destruction of railways, bridges, and other important components of the national infrastructure, a famine in northwest China that killed between 3 million and 6 million people, and isolation of China from a powerful potential ally, the Communist Soviet Union, by attacking the Communist Party of China, which was sponsored by the Soviets. This basic unification meant that China could act as a single state. Chiang Kai-shek became the director of the State Council, the equivalent to the position of president. China was strengthened by economic and political reorganization, although these were put into disarray by Japan's aggression in early 1930s. Additionally, the Communist Party survived the nationalists' attempt to destroy it, creating conditions for further internal conflict. Japan's foreign policy after the First World War through to 1927 was based on negotiation and working within the confines of international diplomacy. As such, Japan signed various treaties and worked to not antagonize the United States or China. Japan stationed some troops to protect its interests in Manchuria and in various port cities in China, but these had been agreed to by treaties, even if they were unpopular in Japan. This was known as the period of the Sidhara diplomacy, named after a Japanese foreign minister, Sidhara, who promoted the use of diplomacy instead of military action. In 1927, at the height of the Northern Expedition in China, this policy changed. Not only did the Japanese prefer a weak, divided China, they were alarmed at the rapid success of Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists. Troops were sent to occupy the Shantung Peninsula, where Japan had long interest and investments. They were also there to support Zhang Zhaolin, the soon-to-be assassinated warlord of Manchuria. It was hoped that a large Japanese force on the Shantung Peninsula would prevent an invasion of Manchuria by the nationalists. With Zhang's assassination, this no longer mattered. They also implemented something called the positive policy towards China, which was adopted by Japan's government in 1927. Essentially, this meant that Japan would treat Manchuria as a special case and not related to its other concerns in the rest of China. It also meant that Japan was no longer interested in the international community's input regarding Manchuria because it was felt that their policies aimed to keep Japan weak and that foreign states simply could not comprehend Japan's needs and interests nor its mission of leading Asia. The Kwantung Army, Japan's elite armed forces, was stationed in the Liaodong Peninsula to safeguard Japan's installation and investments there as it bordered Korea, Japan's colony. After Zhang's assassination in 1928, this army was increased in size as it was realized that a united China might challenge Japan over aspects of Manchuria and the Liaodong Peninsula. The insubordinate officers and others who supported them were not replaced. They continued to believe that their policies and ideas regarding Manchuria were essential for Japan's long-term needs. Japan's government decided to replace the Kwantung Army's leadership to bring this military unit under government control. Hours before the new general was to take charge of the army, the Manchurian crisis occurred. In conclusion, throughout this time period and leading to the rise of fascism, Japan experienced domestic instability. They had a back and forth foreign policy towards China that bordered on diplomacy and making Manchuria a positive case. But with the increased activities of the radical faction in the military, we will see that this will lead to a crisis that will develop in 1931. You have the growth and fear of communism from the 1920s to the 1930s. This is going to lead to many different military factions from moderates to far radicals, all of whom either wanted to reform the government or overthrow it. Multiple actions by military groups to control government occurred using assassinations and coups. The military then began to control the government after 1932. In foreign affairs, you have the warlord era in China. You have the warlord Jiang Zhaolin, who ruled Manchuria, and Manchuria then becomes independent for a small time period in 1922. But Japan's Kwantung Army, their elite forces, is still pressing to make sure that Manchuria has no independence, and they assassinate Jiang in 1928. The Chinese nationalists defeat the warlords and then break their alliance with the communists, and then further go on a very destructive northern expedition. China was now a sole state under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek, which increasingly became a worry for Japan.